I've been working with the channel Purple Insider to deliver great stories about the history of the Minnesota Vikings. Up first, a video about a speech made by Bud Graham before the 1985 season opener against the San Francisco 49ers that might have saved the team. Click the card in the upper right corner or the link in the description to watch now. And now, on with our feature presentation. The Green Bay Packers have been around for over 100 years and have produced great players at every position over that time frame, including on special teams at the kick returner position. Which raises the question, of the hundreds upon hundreds of players to return a kick for the Packers, who is the greatest one of all time? You could go a bunch of different ways with this, from Travis Williams to Al Carmichael, to even guys who were known for other things besides kickoff returns, like Randall Cobb and Hall of Famer Herb Adderley, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, if you asked a lot of people that question, especially since this man is the all-time leader in franchise history in kickoff return yards, they would say that it's this man right here, one of the best return men of the entire 1970s, none other than Steve Odom. There wasn't a whole lot that went right for the Packers in the mid to late 70s, and I think that goes without saying. However, Steve Odom was one of the bright spots during some very dark days. However, while Odom's career was great, and while many people argue to this day that he should be inducted into the Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame, since it is somewhat shocking that the all-time leader in kickoff return yardage isn't among the nearly 200 people in their hall, the end to his career was somewhat bizarre to say the least. Because at the height of his career, when he was as feared as any other man in football at his position, he decided that he was going to walk away from the game. He filled out his retirement papers and called it quits for reasons that we'll get into in just a bit. And then, not even a few weeks later, he was back out there, as though nothing had ever happened. Within a span of a few weeks, he retired and came back. And we're going to take a deep dive into that bizarre matter today. Because this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances, the strangest retirement in the history of the Green Bay Packers franchise. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, and why Odom both walked away from the game and then came back shortly after, we need some context to understand just who Steve Odom was, and how good of a player he was. As you're seeing right now, Odom was not just a return man. When the Packers drafted him in the 5th round of the 1974 NFL Draft out of Utah, it was primarily for his abilities as a wide receiver, especially since he had 19 receiving touchdowns over his final 2 seasons for the Utes, ranking inside the top 5 in the entire NCAA in back-to-back years in this category. And to be fair to Odom, he was a pretty decent receiver in the NFL who had a propensity to use his speed to get behind the defense. If he ever had one-on-one with a cornerback, or he was ever in the open field, it was off to the races. As of the 11 receiving touchdowns that he scored during his NFL career, a whopping 7 of them were at least 40 yards, and 4 of them were for more than 55 yards out, including a 95-yard touchdown catch on the opening drive of a 1977 game against the Minnesota Vikings. During that 1977 season, he averaged an astonishingly high 20.3 yards per catch, which amongst all qualified players in the NFL, ranked 3rd, only behind 2 incredible receivers in Wesley Walker of the New York Jets and Mel Gray of the St. Louis Cardinals. In 1977, the Packers' offense was atrocious, and I talked about that in a previous video of mine, so you can learn more about just how inept they were on that side of the ball by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, you could not blame Odom for that one bit, as he led the team in receiving yards, receptions by a non-running back, and touchdowns. However, while Odom was a solid receiver for a period of time, who could make an impact on offense if needed, and could get behind a defense to cause a ton of trouble, he's best known not for his abilities as a receiver, but rather his abilities as a return man. Because in the 1970s, there were very few return men who were as feared as Odom was. If you couldn't boot the ball out of the end zone for a touchback, then you better hope that you didn't boot it to Odom, because he was going to have the Packers starting at the 30-yard line or better just about every single time. For his efforts as a return man in 1975, he was named a Pro Bowler after not just finishing third in the league in kickoff return yards, but after scoring a touchdown in a game against the New Orleans Saints. But as good as Odom was throughout the 70s, in 1978, he had the best year of his career from a special teams standpoint. He touched the ball 25 times as a return man and picked up 677 yards, which comes out to a great total of 27.1 yards per kickoff return. In 1978, that was the number one total in all of football, and quite frankly, no one even came remotely close to him, seeing as the next closest player, Dennis Pearson of the Atlanta Falcons, was more than a half yard per return behind him. And for some more perspective on how good he was in that category, among players with more than 20 kickoff returns, Odom had, at the time, the third highest yards per return average in a single season in Packers history, as the only players better than him in that category were Dave Hampton, who had 28.6 yards per return in 1971, and Al Carmichael, who had 28.1 yards per return in 1956. And if you don't believe me, ask the Seattle Seahawks, who found out the hard way after they kicked to Odom on the opening kickoff of their Week 7 game, and Odom took it 95 yards to the house for a touchdown, meaning that the Seahawks were down 7-0 before a single play from scrimmage had been called. So after the 1978 season, it was clear that Odom was at the top of his game. Nothing was going to stop him, and he was entering the 1979 season as quite possibly the most feared and the most consistent kickoff return man in all of football, and as a huge asset to the Packers. And even though Odom was coming off of a broken leg to end the 1978 season, he was participating in off-season workouts, and by all accounts, was looking incredible, to the point where trainer Dom Genel said that he was not just fully recovered, but he was going full speed. He was only 26 years old, so he truly was in the prime of his career. The thought of a player at his peak in his prime that was arguably the best at his position just stepping away from the game seems unfathomable, especially when he was participating in off-season workouts and was feeling pretty good. However, while there are certain guys that have no idea what they're going to do with their life after football and have no future goals past their date of expiration in the NFL, there are other guys that are on a very good path. And Odom was one of those guys, because during the offseason, he was getting his doctorate in clinical psychology at La Miranda College out in California. Odom was always fascinated by psychology, to the point where in 1973, while he was still at Utah, not only was he majoring in psychology, but he said that even if he got a shot at pro football, that afterwards, he would love to do some work in the field. Said Odom in 1971 about his love of psychology and why he chose that path, "I don't think psychology is such an offbeat major. I came up here thinking seriously about journalism, but I took one look at the annex, as in the old and rundown buildings that house the journalism department, and decided against it. Then, I got to thinking about my high school days when we used to sit in on psychology seminars conducted by my friend's father. I thoroughly enjoyed the proceedings. Now, I can't wait to complete my studies here so I can move on into clinical psychology, hopefully in family therapy." And Odom obviously loved football. He wouldn't still be playing if he didn't, since he was in a spot where he definitely didn't need to play. This wasn't a job for him. This was fun. Said Odom in a 2011 interview, "I love to play so much that when I watch it on TV now, I still think to myself that I would love to be doing that. I enjoyed kick returning. I enjoyed being a wide receiver. And I enjoyed the people. I loved playing for head coach Bart Starr. He was a great man. Lynn Dickey was a real leader at quarterback and one of my favorite people. I loved my time there. But it was becoming harder and harder for him to focus on psychology only in the off-season. He wanted to finish that doctorate, and it was taking an awfully long time with him bouncing around between Wisconsin during football season and California during the off-season. And after giving it a ton of thought, he decided that in the prime of his career, the best thing to do for his future was to walk away from the sport now and focus all his energy on psychology. Said Odom, "I was thinking that maybe I could find some way to put my athletic and academic careers together for another year. Then last Friday, I decided that the best thing to do in the long run was to make the commitment to my studies. I have many patients now that I can only see on a short-term basis because of my playing football. But now, they can get the long-term treatment that I should be able to offer." He even admitted that retiring won't be easy, saying, "I've had many good experiences with what I consider the best organization in professional football. I know that when the season ends, I always get a little depressed. I have to do something physical. I can tell you, it's going to be tough for a while to be looking in from the outside." And for those wondering, yes, Odom thought about just transferring to Wisconsin so he could stay in the state. But Wisconsin didn't have the offerings that Odom was looking for, as Odom was fascinated by therapy, and Wisconsin was more catered toward research. Plus, he didn't want to abandon his clients. Plus, even if Wisconsin had what he was looking for, it wouldn't have worked in his eyes. Said Odom, "I'd have lost the rhythm of my studies to play another year. Playing always fragmented my clinical work. I had to ask myself if I was doing the right thing to consider transferring, and I couldn't convince myself that I was. I had to make the commitment to my studies. I've only got 2 more semesters to go, and the time to make the break was now." Said Odom, "I want to finish up. I don't have that much longer to go, and I want to do something else. I want to be a psychologist." Obviously, the Packers were heartbroken with us, but they completely understood the decision. I mean, you're giving up an NFL career because you've got a heck of a career lined up for you soon in clinical psychology, which is something that you're passionate about. Head coach Bart Starr said, "We hate to lose Steve because he was a terrific little player, and because his heart is only matched by his concern for his fellow man. We hope someone with as much dignity in class is able to fill his spot. Steve contributed heavily to our special team's success, especially so in 1978, when we sharply reduced his exposure as a receiver and concentrated on his performance with the special teams. Although we're disappointed to lose him, we wish him well, and know he'll enjoy many victories in his new field." And just like that, Steve Odom was gone. It was a tough decision to make for sure, but it's one that Odom clearly thought through, and it didn't seem like anything was going to change his mind. He acknowledged that it was going to be tough to walk away, but he knew that he was preparing for life after football, knew that he couldn't continue playing if he wanted to finish up his degree, and looked at every possible option, from requesting a trade to play for a team in California, to transferring to Wisconsin, to trying to do both options that he had been doing, and decided that this was the best one. This was a carefully thought out move that was extremely deliberate. Just like that, it was the end of an era. Want to know how long that retirement lasted? Not even 2 months. Seriously. Because despite everything that Odom said about it not being physically possible on him to do both his doctorate and his NFL career at the same time, despite Odom saying that he couldn't abandon his clients and wanted to provide them with long-term help instead of short-term help, and despite Odom saying for over a year with his family and his close ones that he was going to be done soon and that 1978 was it, he couldn't walk away from the game just yet. By pure coincidence, on August 8th, one newspaper put out an article about how training camp was going, and who was going to replace Steve Odom as the kickoff return guy. And literally 1 day later, in the most poorly aged article ever, on August 9th, sure enough, Steve Odom was back. The retirement didn't last long at all. I can't even call it a retirement. As Starr said on Odom's decision to come back, he called me and said he was very sincere in his original desire to retire. But after several weeks, and thinking about it a little more carefully, he missed the game a great deal. It's just bizarre that he changed his mind about this, though, for a few reasons. Number one, he knew that he was going to miss the game. He talked about that when he retired, and how that was going to be a struggle, but a necessary evil, and how he took up racquetball to stay busy and stay competitive and stay active. Nothing changed there. Number two, it's not as though the school gave him an ultimatum that you have to pick the NFL or a program, and then changed its mind. No new information was presented whatsoever. And number three, nothing new popped up. It's not as though it got easier for him to play and do the program. It's not as though he could give long-term help to his patients instead of just short-term. It's not as though he could take practice time off to go out to California. It's not as though he could take classes remotely or not be present. This was the same exact scenario that he had planned and deliberated on for over a year, and justified in every way by going through every hypothetical and why this was the right choice. And yet, he comes back just a few weeks later? No one, not a single person, saw this one coming. Everyone felt that Odom was done for, and that he was ready to start the next chapter of his career. And then, he was back as though nothing had happened. And for the record, Odom was not very good in 1979, as he was released by the Packers midway through the season, and had his yards per return average dip by roughly 6 yards over what it was in 1978. Odom was out of the NFL for good after 1979. I think what makes this situation so strange is that Odom mapped out literally everything. This wasn't something where he made the decision on the fly. He planned this out for over a year. This wasn't something where he was unsure of what would happen. He knew exactly what would happen, from how he would feel afterwards to how his life would be now that he was focusing solely on psychology. And this wasn't something where he didn't weigh every scenario to see if there was an alternative. He did exactly that, seeing as he lived that lifestyle for the past few years. And anything that you can think of, from transferring to getting traded to a West Coast team, he thought of. And yet, despite all of that, and despite careful deliberation with weighing the pros and cons of everything, he unretired a few weeks later, and decided that everything he said wasn't quite true. It was a bizarre moment of indecision for a player who seemed very decisive his whole career, and who played kick returner, which is arguably the one position where you can't be indecisive, as you just gotta go. Because in 1979, Odom wasn't just changing the minds of his patients, he was changing his own mind as well. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.